It feels strange now to think back on that place, almost like a dream or a fantastical tale I heard as a child. But the evidence is undeniable. It happened. At the time, I was a private investigator. Nothing glamorous, mostly finding missing people, catching cheating spouses, and similar mundane tasks. It wasn't much, but it paid the bills. My partner, Mark Wiles, and I had been running our business, my Wiles and Scott Investigations, for a few years. The sign on the door bore both our names, a decision we'd settled on with a game of cards. The case that changed everything began as most of them do, unassuming and straightforward. A middle-aged man, whose name I can't disclose, approached us to find his missing wife and daughter. He explained that they had gone on a road trip together, planning to stop in a few towns along the way. However, during the trip, he was called back to work unexpectedly and had to leave them to continue on their own. They were going to come back with me, he said, but I told him to keep going and I'd meet them soon as this work mess got sorted out. The client provided us with their itinerary. He had originally planned to take 2 weeks off, but was summoned back after just 3 days. 2 days later, he traveled by train to the station where he was supposed to meet them. When they didn't arrive on the first train, he assumed they had missed it. But when they failed to appear on the next one, panic set in. He called the hotel they had stayed at. The receptionist confirmed that his wife and daughter had checked out that morning around 9:34 a.m., leaving plenty of time to catch the train scheduled for 11:25. However, their train tickets were never used. He then took the next train heading in their direction. Convinced he'd find them at the station, or perhaps stranded on the roadside with car trouble. But neither scenario played out. When he arrived at the station, his wife and daughter were nowhere to be found. He hired a car and drove back along the route they would have taken, expecting to find them with a flat tire or some other minor inconvenience. Instead, there was nothing. Their car wasn't at the station or the hotel. They had simply vanished. The next morning, Mark and I boarded a train heading to the town where the family had last been seen. That night, I barely slept. I had vivid dreams, nightmares of events long past and others I couldn't understand, filled with shadows and a foreboding sense of doom. The dreams were so disturbing that even when I woke up, they lingered in the back of my mind. Once we arrived at the town, Mark and I retraced the family's steps. We visited the hotel they had stayed at, where the receptionist recalled the wife and daughter. They were polite, she said, but the little girl seemed off. Quiet, sullen. She spent most of her time standing by the lobby window, staring out at the woods. It was strange. She ignored her mother calling her twice, like she was in a trance. We then contacted the train station. The clerk on duty couldn't remember seeing the mother or daughter, as he had worked too many shifts since then. There were also no records of a car being left or towed from the station's parking lot. The breakthrough came by chance. While driving back along the family's presumed route, Mark spotted an overgrown dirt path hidden behind thick foliage. It wasn't marked on any map. Pulling back the branches, we found faint tire tracks in the soft dirt. Mark grinned. "Looks like we're checking this out," he said. We returned to the car and carefully navigated down the narrow path. It was overgrown and shadowed by thick trees, the branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The deeper we went, the heavier the air seemed to grow, thick, damp, and oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eventually, the trees thinned, and the path opened up into a clearing. To our surprise, we found ourselves in a small, eerie town. It was silent, almost lifeless. The streets were empty, and though many of the shops had open signs in their windows, there wasn't a soul in sight. "This place gives me the creeps," Mark muttered. We parked the car and decided to split up. Mark went to investigate an old inn with a faded rooms for rent sign, while I headed toward a diner down the street. As I walked, I noticed how strange the town felt. The buildings were run down, and the few people I did see were pale, gaunt, and unwelcoming. At one point, a school bus passed by, dropping off children. But even they seemed wrong. They were quiet, their faces blank, and their movements stiff. I approached the bus to ask the driver some questions, but as soon as he saw me, his face twisted in terror. He slammed on the gas, speeding away before I could get a word out. The children who had disembarked vanished into the shadows of the buildings, as if they had never been there. Shaken, I continued to the diner. It was a shabby place with peeling paint and a flickering neon open sign. When I tried the door, it was locked. I knocked, and after a moment, a woman appeared from the back. She was thin to the point of emaciation, her cheekbones sharp and her arms little more than skin and bone. Her wiry auburn hair was patchy, with bald spots visible on her scalp. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and hostility, her pale lips pressed into a tight line. "Can I help you, mister?" she asked, her voice hollow and distant. I tried to explain who I was and why I was there, but the more I spoke, the more uncomfortable she seemed. Her eyes darted nervously toward the windows, as though expecting someone or something to appear at any moment. My experience at the diner left me frustrated. The gaunt woman's sharp dismissal stuck with me, especially her words. "You're not going to find anything here." Her tone and choice of words felt suspicious. Something wasn't right. Determined to press on, I decided to check on Mark at the hotel. On my way, I noticed 2 cars parked in the hotel lot, a rare sign of life in this eerily deserted town. Before heading inside, I chose to look around the property. That's when I made my first breakthrough. A broken license plate lying near the fence in a secondary parking lot. The plate was split in 2, but the upper half was enough to confirm it belonged to the rental car used by the missing family. I brought the plate back to our car and locked it in the trunk, my confidence restored. This was the first solid lead we'd uncovered since arriving. Feeling reinvigorated, I decided to knock on a few doors in the town, hoping to get some answers. The residents, however, were as unhelpful as ever. Most houses didn't answer at all. A few people, a couple of teenagers and a young man, claimed to know nothing, but one particular encounter chilled me to the bone. At one house, a child's small figure appeared behind the frosted glass of the front door. From my vantage point, I could only make out the blurry outline of the child, its features distorted by the glass. "Hello?" I called, knocking again. The child didn't move. It just stood there, silent and unmoving, staring at me through the door. I waved, hoping to elicit a response. Instead, the child pressed its face against the glass, its expression eerily blank. My discomfort grew unbearable. Deciding I wouldn't get anything useful from this house, or this strange, lifeless child, I walked away quickly, eager to put some distance between myself and that door. As I moved further down the street, replaying the strange events in my mind, a voice suddenly broke through my thoughts. "You're asking questions in the wrong place." Startled, I stumbled off the curb, nearly falling flat on my face. I spun around to find a teenage girl leaning casually over the railing of a house elevated slightly above the street. She looked to be about 16 or 17, pale like everyone else in town. However, her face lacked the dark circles and haunted expressions I had seen on others. Most strikingly, she had the faintest hint of a smile, something no one else in this town had shown. "What was that?" I asked, regaining my composure. "I said, you're asking questions in the wrong place," she repeated. Her tone was calm, but her words carried an air of caution. "No one here's going to answer their doors to you, and if they do, they won't tell you anything." "Oh, really?" I replied, stepping closer. "And why is that?" "Because no one here likes visitors," she said matter-of-factly. "And they like it even less when people come around asking questions." I raised an eyebrow. "You don't seem so tight-lipped, if you don't mind me saying." The girl chuckled softly, leaning further over the railing. "That's because I don't care what they think. I'm not like them." I took a step closer. "Then maybe you can help me. I'm looking for a woman and a little girl." "I know who you're talking about," she interrupted. "And you won't find them by wandering around this town. If you're smart, you'll leave now before it's too late." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Do you know where they are?" The girl hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if to check for eavesdroppers. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of unease. "They were here, but they're not anymore." "Where did they go?" I pressed. The girl shook her head. "You don't understand. This place, it's not safe. People don't leave this town. They disappear. If you keep digging, the same thing might happen to you." Before I could ask anything else, she straightened up and stepped back from the railing. "If you know what's good for you, you'll leave. Don't let it take you too." With that cryptic warning, she turned and disappeared into the house, leaving me alone in the street with more questions than answers. The young girl revealed her name as Sophie. She wasn't a native to the town, but had moved there 15 years ago with her mother. while the townsfolk had grown cold and unwelcoming, she seemed to carry a mischievous, almost playful demeanor that set her apart from the rest. When I asked her for help, she surprised me with valuable information. She had seen the missing woman and child. According to Sophie, they had arrived in town a few days before vanishing. Their car had been spotted at the hotel, and she had even spoken briefly with the mother. The woman had explained that her daughter wasn't feeling well and had asked her to pull over. The daughter then pointed out the hidden lane, saying they should take it because the town ahead might have food to make her feel better. What was strange, though, was that this town wasn't marked on regular maps. I asked about it, and Sophie explained that only local maps showed the town's location. After their arrival, Sophie mentioned suggesting a walk in the woods to the mother, as the area had several old paths. The woman seemed interested, but Sophie didn't see them after that conversation. Did they take the walk? I asked. I don't know, Sophie replied, her expression shifting into something unreadable. But the girl asked a lot of questions about the woods. I jotted down every detail Sophie provided, thanked her for her help, and returned to the car, feeling hopeful. Later that evening, I met up with Mark at the hotel. The two of us exchanged notes over dinner, combining what we had learned. The hotel clerk confirmed that the missing mother and daughter had stayed overnight. They had checked in, eaten at the diner, and signed the hotel register. However, the phone lines in the town had been down due to a storm, which explained why the mother hadn't contacted her husband. The car trouble Sophie mentioned also matched with what Mark had heard. The family had stayed a few extra days while waiting for their vehicle to be repaired. But beyond that, their trail went cold. It seemed as though the mother and child had simply vanished after leaving the hotel. Nothing about the case felt particularly sinister, at least not on the surface. The details seemed mundane, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something lurking beneath it all. Some piece of the puzzle I was missing. Exhausted after the long day, Mark and I decided to stay the night at the hotel and continue our investigation in the morning. But sleep did not bring me any peace. That night, I was plagued by another nightmare. In my dream, I was running down a dirt path surrounded by thick bushes and trees. The light was fading rapidly, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Something was chasing me. A pale, dog-like creature that slinked through the underbrush with unnerving speed. I could feel its presence, but every time I turned to look, it vanished into the shadows. Then it would reappear, its long, bony limbs shuffling through the trees, its human-like eyes glaring at me with a predatory intensity. Its snarling muzzle and sloping forehead made it look like something born from the worst depths of my imagination. I ran as fast as I could, but the creature was always there, keeping pace, toying with me. Suddenly, I tripped and fell, rolling into the dirt. As I scrambled to my feet, the creature emerged from the bushes. It was horrifying. Its emaciated, skeletal body stood tall, limbs stretching unnaturally as it rose onto its hind legs. Its face, a grotesque fusion of human and animal, loomed closer. I tried to crawl away, but the creature stepped forward, pressing one of its paw-like three-toed feet against my chest, pinning me to the ground effortlessly. The creature leaned in, its long face mere inches from my own. I could feel its breath, hot and rancid, as it stared into my eyes with a malevolent hunger. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I awoke from the nightmare in a panic, my chest heaving as though the creature's clawed foot had truly pinned me down. It was 3:10 a.m. The room around me felt unfamiliar, but as my groggy mind pieced things together, I remembered where I was. The hotel in that eerie town, trying to solve a disappearance that seemed to grow more bizarre by the hour. I sat on the edge of the bed, wiping sweat from my face, muttering to myself about the recurring nightmares. Eventually, I made my way to the small kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. The window above the sink overlooked the forest behind the hotel. It was a bright night, with the three-quarters moon casting enough light to illuminate the parking area and the trees beyond. As I gazed outside, something caught my attention. A white figure flickered between the trees at the edge of the forest. Squinting, I leaned closer to the glass. It was a woman, her white dress glowing faintly in the moonlight. Then I noticed more shapes, figures moving among the trees. Dark clothed and shrouded in shadow, they seemed to blend into the night, save for their shifting forms. My stomach churned as my eyes adjusted to the scene. There weren't just a few people. There were dozens, maybe more, all weaving through the trees like a writhing mass. The movements reminded me of maggots crawling through a decaying corpse, an image I quickly tried to banish from my mind. "What the hell is going on out there?" I muttered, my pulse quickening. I threw on my clothes and crossed the hall to Mark's room. I pounded on the door, knowing full well how difficult it was to wake my partner. Mark's loud snoring rumbled from behind the door, but after repeated knocks and shouts, he finally answered, groggy and disheveled. "Alex," Mark grumbled, rubbing his eyes, "do you know what time it is?" "Yeah, I do," I replied urgently. "Listen, I just saw half the damn town wandering into the woods." Mark blinked, his mind slowly processing the words. "What? Are you serious?" "Dead serious. Get dressed. We're going to check it out." Within 10 minutes, we were outside, flashlights and pistols in hand, heading toward the tree line. "Any idea how many people you saw?" Mark whispered as we crossed the back parking lot. "There were too many to count. It was dark, but the place was crawling with them," I replied, my nerves on edge. As we approached the woods, Mark clicked on his flashlight and shined it across the ground. Footprints were clearly visible in the dirt. "Well, I'll be damned," Mark said with a low whistle. "Looks like you weren't dreaming after all." I gave him a look, and Mark chuckled softly. "Hey, I'm just saying," he added, his tone lighthearted, though it was clear he felt the tension too. He switched off the flashlight to avoid giving away our presence, and we pressed deeper into the forest. The trail of footprints was easy to follow under the moonlight. The tracks crisscrossed and converged in places, but ultimately led in a single direction. I tried to recall the area's layout from the map we had studied earlier. My best guess was that we were heading toward the base of a nearby mountain. The ground began to incline, and the thick forest slowly gave way to a steeper, drier path. The trees thinned out, revealing more of the sky above. I wiped the sweat from my brow, glancing back at Mark, who seemed unaffected by the climb. I cursed my own lack of fitness, a sharp contrast to Mark, who moved with the ease of someone far more accustomed to physical exertion. "We're getting close to something," I said between breaths. "Yeah," Mark replied, "but the question is, close to what?" The path leveled out briefly before opening into a large clearing. In the center of the clearing, illuminated by the moonlight, was a massive pit. It was circular, its walls steep and uneven, and it was far deeper than either of us could make out in the dark. Surrounding the pit were the townspeople, standing in silence. Their pale faces glowed faintly in the moonlight, and their expressions were eerily blank. "What the hell are they doing?" Mark whispered, his voice low but filled with unease. Before I could answer, the crowd began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they shuffled toward the edge of the pit. One by one, they climbed down into the darkness, their figures disappearing into the abyss. As Mark and I advanced through the dense thicket of trees, the silence became suffocating. Not a single animal stirred. My nerves, already frayed, were stretched thinner by the unnatural stillness. "Do you hear that?" Mark whispered, his voice low but tense. I paused, straining my ears. "Hear what?" "Exactly. Nothing. No animals. No wind. It's dead quiet." I nodded, chewing the inside of my cheek. The eerie silence wrapped around us like a blanket, thick and stifling. Then a faint snap came from somewhere nearby. Both of us froze, our bodies taut as bowstrings. Another snap, this time to the right. I turned my head sharply and instinctively drew my pistol. My flashlight illuminated a figure. Sophie, standing calmly in her white dress, her playful smile intact. "What the hell are you doing out here?" I demanded, my voice shaking slightly. Before I could get an answer, my head exploded with light and pain. A heavy blow struck me just above the ear, and everything went blurry. Dimly, I heard the sounds of scuffling behind me, followed by two distinct thuds. Then there was darkness. When I regained consciousness, I was being dragged. Grass and leaves passed beneath me as someone hauled me forward by the back of my shirt. I tried lifting my head, but the world spun violently, forcing me to let it hang limply again. The muffled sounds around me were disjointed, as though I were underwater. Slowly, clarity returned, and I realized my arms were tightly bound behind my back. I tried struggling, but my captor, a bald man with pale, sickly skin, delivered a sharp blow to the back of my head, rendering me temporarily limp again. When I managed to raise my head a second time, I caught sight of Sophie walking just ahead of me, her white dress almost glowing in the moonlight. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of dragging. Turning as much as I could, I saw another pale man, a patchy bearded figure, carrying Mark's unconscious body over one shoulder. In the man's other hand was a baseball bat, likely the weapon used to knock us both out. Ahead, through the trees, I spotted a cliff face. As we approached, the ominous sight of an abandoned mine entrance came into view. The gaping black mouth of the mine sent a primal wave of fear coursing through me. My gut churned, and every instinct screamed for me to get away. Sophie disappeared into the darkness of the mine, her white dress vanishing entirely as she stepped inside. The bald man paused at the entrance, visibly uneasy. He hesitated until a faint orange light flickered from deep within the mine. The light grew brighter, revealing another figure approaching, a shirtless man, his pale skin blotched with dirt and grime, holding an oil lamp. His gaunt face was expressionless as he spoke. The words that came from his mouth weren't human. They were guttural, alien, and wrong, like a language pulled from the depths of something ancient and malevolent. Glafak fugakar iagfarasun. The bald man nodded in acknowledgement, then dragged me into the mine. Behind us, the man with the baseball bat followed. The deeper we ventured into the mine, the more oppressive the air became. The flickering light of the oil lamp cast distorted shadows on the rocky walls, and the narrow tunnels seemed to close in on us. My mind raced as I struggled to think of a way to escape. But every time I tried to move or shift my weight, my captors would jostle me roughly, keeping me subdued. Baldy, who had carried me with ease earlier, now seemed nervous. His eyes darted around, wide and anxious, as if he expected something to leap out of the shadows. The deeper we went, the more his unease grew. Finally, the tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber. The air here was colder, heavier. At the center of the chamber was a large pit, perfectly round, its depth obscured by darkness. The edges of the pit were lined with jagged rocks, and an unnatural sound emanated from its depths, a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the air and into my bones. The townsfolk were already there, standing silently in a wide circle around the pit. Their blank, pale faces reflected the flickering orange light. Sophie stood at the edge of the pit, her white dress flowing in the stale air. She turned to face me, her smile unnervingly wide. "It's time," she said softly. My heart raced as I was dragged closer to the pit. Every fiber of my being screamed in protest. The hum from the pit grew louder, deeper, resonating with a malevolent power. My captors dragged me deeper into the mine, the air growing heavier and more suffocating with each step. The walls, once structured and uniform, had given way to rough, natural caves, with tunnels branching out like veins through the mountain. Time seemed warped in those suffocating depths, stretching and compressing until I lost all sense of it. As we descended, I swore I saw faces in the shadows, pale, distorted faces staring from the darkness. Some appeared human, while others had grotesque, canine-like features with elongated skulls and sharp, glinting teeth. Eventually, the tight walls opened into a vast cavern. The sheer size of it was overwhelming, an expanse of darkness that swallowed everything outside the faint glow of the oil lamp carried by my captors. I felt my fear deepen as they dragged me toward the center of the chamber, where a jagged ledge overlooked what seemed like an endless abyss. Sophie stood there, her smile unnervingly wide. The flickering lamplight illuminated her white dress, making her appear almost spectral. "Hello again, detective," she said, her voice sweet yet dripping with malice. I glared at her, suppressing my fear. Despite my bound arms and the hopelessness of the situation, I refused to show her how terrified I was. With a nod from Sophie, the bald man dropped me onto the cold ground. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, leaving me gasping in the dirt. All around me, faint noises echoed through the cavern. Shuffling footsteps, the distant splash of water, and an ominous low hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. When I finally looked up, Sophie was standing just beyond the glow of the oil lamp, her silhouette against the darkness. "I didn't want them to be too rough with you, detective," Sophie said, her tone mocking. I shuffled backward, feeling the ground behind me to gauge my surroundings. Sophie smirked. "Careful," she warned, gesturing toward the ledge. "There's quite the drop nearby." I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something horrifying. Around me, in the darkness beyond the lamp's glow, were reflections. Hundreds of tiny pinpoints of light surrounded me. Eyes. The cavern was filled with them. What are they? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. They're the people of the town, Sophie replied, her voice calm and matter-of-fact. They're not as talkative as they used to be, but they're still here. They're always here. The eyes remained unblinking, locked on me. They're only keeping back because of the light, Sophie continued. But they're very hungry, detective. My head snapped back to her. Where are we? What the hell is this place? Sophie didn't answer immediately. She walked toward the ledge and gazed into the abyss. The distant sound of rushing water grew louder, echoing in the cavern. This is one of the old mines, she said at last. You know, the ones I told you about earlier. The miners had no idea what they found when they broke through that wall. But we've learned. What do you mean? It's just a cave, I said, desperate to keep her talking while I scanned my surroundings for any chance of escape. Oh no, Sophie replied, turning back to me with a grin. It's far more than that. This isn't a cave, detective. It's a chapel. She bent down and picked up my flashlight, which had been taken from me earlier. She pointed it toward the abyss. And this, she said, her grin widening as she dropped the flashlight into the darkness, is the altar. The flashlight tumbled into the pit, its beams spinning wildly. For a brief moment, its light illuminated something massive below. My breath caught in my throat. It was a monstrous creature, its immense head covered in dozens of glowing eyes that glared upward. Horns sprouted from its temples, curving back and around like a twisted crown. Its circular maw was lined with rows upon rows of sharp blade-like teeth, and its spider-like arms stretched outward, ending in webbed, clawed hands that scraped against the walls of the pit. The image burned into my mind before the flashlight hit the water far below, plunging everything back into darkness. Sophie turned back to me, her voice dripping with mock reverence. That is our god, detective. My body froze in terror, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just seen. We are changed here, Sophie continued. We are evolved. My gaze darted to the eyes surrounding me. They were no longer just eyes. Faces began to emerge from the shadows, pale, elongated faces with sharp features and distorted proportions. The townsfolk stepped closer, their forms grotesque and alien, their movements unnatural. I turned back to Sophie, only to find that she, too, was changing. As Sophie stepped closer, the flickering light revealed her transformation. Her arms grew longer, the forearms stretching grotesquely, while her fingers twisted into clawed shapes. The space above her eyebrows split open, oozing blood as her skull elongated. Her teeth sharpened into jagged fangs, and her playful smile turned into something predatory and horrifying. My heart pounded as I scrambled backward, inching dangerously close to the ledge. I glanced over the edge, weighing my chances of survival if I jumped. "Don't run, detective," the creature hissed, its voice now deeper, more guttural. "It's better if you don't fight it." The monstrous townsfolk closed in, their distorted faces illuminated in the faint light of the oil lamp. My options dwindled as the chanting from the abyss grew louder, echoing with a malevolent force that shook the cavern. The creature, no longer fully human, stood before me, its grotesque form towering over me. Its jaw and nose had elongated into a canine-like muzzle, its black hair falling in stringy clumps over its inhuman face. As its second set of eyes opened, its distorted voice still carried a chilling echo of its former self, made all the more unsettling by its familiarity. In a desperate moment of terror, I blurted, "The mother? The child?" The creature paused, tilting its grotesque head as though considering my question. "The mother," it rasped, its voice still disturbingly young. "For me." "The child?" I pressed, trembling as I remained frozen in fear. The creature nodded toward the pit. "Youth helps to sustain him." The horrifying revelation barely had time to sink in when a sudden burst of blinding light cut through the darkness from my right. Both the creature and I turned toward it. The entity hissed, recoiling from the light. Bang! 2 gunshots rang out. A deafening roar followed by a shrill, otherworldly shriek echoed through the cavern. I opened my eyes to see the creature's dress aflame. Its elongated limbs flailed wildly, trying to extinguish the fire. Instinct took over. I kicked at the creature's thin knee, hearing a satisfying crack as it buckled. With all the strength I could muster, I grabbed its arm and hauled it over myself, dragging it toward the ledge. The creature tumbled over the edge, spinning into the darkness, its flaming body lighting its descent. Its howls of agony echoed from the abyss, growing fainter as it fell deeper and deeper. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my collar. Twisting in panic, I swung blindly, expecting another attack. "Alex, you'd better still be able to fucking run," a voice barked, pulling me to my feet. I barely had time to process before I was shoved forward. "That way! Fucking go!" The next moments blurred together in my mind. A deep, guttural howl erupted from the pit, shaking the very walls of the cavern. The ground beneath our feet trembled violently, and chunks of rock began to rain down from the ceiling. Both of us sprinted through the collapsing mine, dodging falling debris as the resonant howl seemed to follow us, filling the air with its raw, otherworldly power. Behind us, the inhuman voices of the creatures echoed in the dark, growing closer with every second. Finally, we broke free into the early morning light. The forest was silent, almost serene, in stark contrast to the chaos we had just escaped. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, our bodies battered and bruised, covered in scrapes and dust. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. When we eventually made our way back to the town, we found our car had been moved, but not far. It sat idling just outside the hotel. The front seat was dusted with a strange yellow ash. Without a word, we climbed into the car and drove away. The miles passed in silence, neither of us willing to discuss what had happened in the mine. It wasn't until we returned the rental car that Mark finally broke the silence. He explained how, after I was knocked unconscious, he had fought off the second attacker and escaped into the forest. Circling back, he had tracked the group to the mine by following the faint glow of the oil lamp in the distance. Mark described how he had crept through the cavern, sticking to the shadows. Though he could see the creatures moving in the darkness, they were too focused on me to notice him. Waiting for the right moment, he had fired at the oil lamp, setting the creature's clothing alight and giving me the chance to act. I eventually shared what I had seen in the pit. The grotesque creature with countless eyes, its webbed claws and circular maw filled with endless rows of teeth. Mark listened, though it was unclear if he believed the story. "I don't know if what we saw down there was real," I admitted, "but I know one thing. I'm glad we got out alive, and I hope that thing stays buried in that pit." The two of us parted ways, but the events of that night stayed with us, haunting our dreams and gnawing at the edges of our minds. Neither Mark nor I ever returned to that town. The investigation was abandoned, and the missing family was never found. Whatever answers lay in the mine remained buried in darkness, along with the creature that called it home.